What if I told you that one of the largest cities in the United States of America was founded by a black man, John Baptiste Point du Sable, who in the late 1700s spoke 4 different languages, as well as numerous indigenous ones, had gone to school in France, but he founded and built the first permanent structures in Chicago. He owned over 800 acres of land, a lot of which, from what I understand, is what downtown Chicago is today. As we've seen before, that land was taken from here, and his name was etched away and erased from history books until the 2000s, from what I have been reading. Well, today I'm going to connect that story, the story of Chicago, to the individual who started the Pullman cars. George Pullman created an industry that hired more African Americans at that time than ever before with his Pullman cars. And I'm going to start here in Henry County in doing so. Hey, I'm Joshua Teach-Us, and today we're talking about history hidden in plain sight. So in 1900, Georgia had its Titanic moment. And what I mean by that is, you see this marker. It tells the story about the worst train wreck in Georgia's history. In June of that year, if I'm not mistaken, it's right here on the marker. In June of that year, the train headed from Macon, going to Atlanta, crashed and dropped 60 feet. Only 39 people died. And the survivors' names are listed here. Those who died's name are listed here. It said that the train conductor, if you will, it was raining and folks were scared and skeptical about heading to Atlanta after it'd been raining bad for 3 weeks, and they were fearing that the tracks might actually be washed out, which they were. He said, we're either going to have breakfast in Atlanta in the morning or in hell. And ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that train crashed. So many people died. The dead bodies were laid out at the square of McDonough, which is why this marker is here. But it was the Camp Creek train wreck. And those bodies were laid out for folks to come identify them. From what I understand, some bodies may have never been recovered in the creek up under the pressure of the train, and some of them were later identified. But I'm here to tell the story about the railroad industry today. History hidden in plain sight. You see, the railroad industry was an opportunity for African Americans to make a living in this country. One of the individuals who died, his name was Ed Bird, my middle and last name and my father's first and last name. So immediately I was interested in reading this story. But my father was a fireman on the railroad, and his father was a fireman on the railroad. See, the railroad industry after slavery gave individuals an opportunity to earn a decent living. And so they did. It goes back though, and that railroad industry and those jobs go all the way back and connect with the civil rights movement. And here's how. After President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he of course had already issued Field Order 15 that issued the 400,000 acres to individuals who were newly freed in the South following the Ebenezer Creek Massacre, where thousands died following the Union soldiers for freedom. Well, once he was assassinated, a gentleman from New York named George Pullman relocated to Chicago, and I just told you that Chicago was founded by a black man, relocated there, not only ultimately built a community of housing to go along with his Pullman train cars, but became the largest employer of African Americans in United States history. But it wasn't all good. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of discrimination. In fact, calling them George as George's boy, named after George Pullman, who started the Pullman cars, they were called Pullman Porters. They often argued against that, but they could not join the Union. It would not be till years later that A. Philip Randolph came along and helped them organize. And the organizations were for both the Pullman Porters and the maids, because women also worked on those trains. But just to know something about the conditions, sometimes they worked up to 20 hours a day. And so they was working, they were organizing, and they were petitioning for better working conditions, for livable wages, to not be sexually assaulted, to not have to lay down on all fours or get down on all fours and have the white children ride their backs and pet their heads for good luck. These were the kind of conditions that they were working up under. Again, because they were black, they couldn't join the union, and so they worked under constant discrimination and pressure. Well, A. Philip Randolph, who helped them organize, is known as the father of the civil rights movement. He was a mentor for Martin Luther King. He worked with 3 different presidents. Once he organized a march that was to be a march of 100,000 on Washington in the 1940s. And I think it was Roosevelt succumbed to his threats to march and gave him what he wanted, was to end discrimination in the defense industry. He did it again with the next president, who ended discrimination and Jim Crow practices in the military. Well, he also worked along with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and organized the infamous March on Washington. And he also introduced Dr. King on that day that he gave his I Have a Dream speech. But there's a little known individual a lot of folks don't talk about. I believe his name was E.D. Dixon. Well, he was a Pullman porter. He worked on the railroad trains, and I'm here just to remind you all about the significance that the train industry, the railroad industry, had for African Americans at the time. Well, he took what he learned from organizing labor in the railroad industry as a Pullman porter and applied it to Montgomery. You see, he was solely responsible, the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. He worked with the NAACP and folks like Rosa Parks and handpicked her to be the one that they used as their case to sit down and refuse to give up her seat on the bus. He asked for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted over 13 months. Now, you talk about Uber, you talk about ride shares. That was the first in American history. But today we're talking about history hidden in plain sight. I'm at a market that tells a story about Georgia's Titanic moment. And I'm also here to connect the story of that railroad and the railroad industry to the civil rights movement in the United States and some of the key figures. Again, I'm Joshua, who teaches us history in plain sight, history hidden in plain sight. Have an amazing day.